Oh, hello there. Yes, well, good grief. One of these days I won't say good grief. Not today, though. Currently working with a student, and we're looking at America. America, that's interesting indeed, yes. 1920 to, I think it's 73, 74, that particular unit for GCSE. And, sort of just been doing the Depression and the Second World War. And sort of thinking about parallels like today, because you do with history, don't you? You do think about those parallels. I mean, some people in my comments don't like me making parallels between fascism and Hitler. Oh, that would be stupid, wouldn't it? Anyway, yeah. One of the things in the 1930s was, in order to get out of the Great Depression, governments initially tried to do the sort of classical economics thing of absolutely nothing. And that didn't work because, it was Great Depression. So what they then tried to do was the other sort of classical economic thing of, clamping down with austerity. And, that didn't work either. In fact, it made things a lot worse. You may recall hunger strikes and hunger marches and, an entire generation who were scarred with the notion of men coming round and demanding that they sell furniture, etc. I grew up in an era where the old, generically, didn't want to claim benefits because of that stigma. But it didn't work. And what did start to work, generically across the world, including in fascist states, was a form of Keynesian economics whereby the player of last resort in the economy, the government, actually spent money and got things moving, leading to a reasonably better economy by about 1937, 1938 in various places. The only thing that realistically actually sorted out unemployment in America was, the war against fascism from 1941 onwards there. But even then there was a sort of stubborn, 42, 43, there was a stubborn sort of 500,000 Americans adult Americans who were unemployed. And I might come back to that as a concept in just a second. But what we're faced with in Britain is after 15 years of, all those sort of classical economic things about, the way that austerity will definitely allow the private sector to flood in and make everything fine. Well, it appears that a bit like the early 30s, that hasn't quite worked, which is a bit strange, really, isn't it? Strange, isn't it? So, of course, having had that not working, our classically trained, very, very, very brilliantly people, or not classically trained, very, very brilliant people, but people with a particular political agenda, for example, the idea that government should do nothing, are very keen on, just more of the same. So I did have to smile at this, which was from the Telegraph yesterday. More than 200,000 young men signed off work for life. Oh my God. Labour blamed for rise in worklessness, of course, as thousands aged between 16 and 29 are handed universal credit with no requirement to look for jobs. Yes, which is appalling, isn't it? Appalling and appalling and appalling and appalling. And it's all Labour's fault for the last 14 months or however long it's definitely been their fault for, because it was no one's fault before that. Certainly no newly arrived members of Reform. Definitely not. But that sounds great. But the problem I had, for example, you can read the article, link below inevitably, with this, is it has no context to it whatsoever. Yeah. Okay, 200,000 young men. Well, I mean, that's just a number that you've sort of plucked out of the air. 16 to 29 is a sort of arbitrary group of people, generally speaking, but okay, let's go with that. But start thinking, if you will, about the number of young people there are between 16 and 29 who realistically can't work. And suddenly, when you place it in that context, when you ask that or make that sort of awkward statement about it, it becomes a lot clearer. Just think about IQs, okay? Think about IQs. Now, we all have met, and I, as an SEN teacher, work with quite a lot of people with fairly low IQs, okay? The moment you get down to about 75 and below, you are sort of bumping along the bottom. Anyone with an IQ on that kind of range, and that's about 5% of the population, possibly a bit more, you're going to have to put a lot of effort in to get any work out of them, because they have to be shown everything, often time and time again, for a wide variety of things that we might call MLD in my line of business, or sometimes it's even worse with SLD, but leaving that aside, you have to put a lot of work in, yeah? When I've worked in special needs schools, sometimes you get kids that want to be helpful, and your heart always sinks because you know that any job that you ask them to help you with will take 3 times as long because you have to guide them through. It's that low IQ thing. I'm not being rude about people with low IQs, but people with low IQs aren't very, very employable. Yeah? That's it. By the time you get to about 80, 90, etc., you're fine. Basically, you're not dealing with the brightest sparks in the box, and etc. That's a very bad metaphor, but you get the concept, yeah. But the Telegraph piece here just labels people as they should work, and you might argue, well, people should work, but what work are you going to give somebody who can only basically push a broom? Because the pushing broom jobs disappeared round about the same time. Well, I was about 10. They just don't exist anymore. Those low-level sort of manual jobs just aren't things that are out there. Nobody wants to employ you to wash up. They have machines. Nobody wants to employ you to simply carry things. Nobody wants to do that. The most menial jobs that there are actually require a reasonably high level of education in real terms, yeah? You might argue about stacking shelves, but people don't want shelf stackers, do they? They want people that can do lots of different things and stack shelves. Anyway, leaving aside the disingenuous nature of the Daily Telegraph, that brings me neatly to reform, inevitably, and Richard Tice, perhaps inevitably. A man never knowingly right about anything. But we had this from the first, right? Reformed UK's deputy leader claims parents are using and abusing, I don't know, no idea, free taxis for send children, and warns unsustainable spending will bankrupt local councils. Yes, indeed. And various people, Richard Tice, etc., and, the rest of the reform lot and the Tories are very, very worried about the amount of money that SEN is costing us. And nobody, again, it's that thing, nobody sort of says, well, why is it that this costing has gone up by so much? And I don't know. It's probably all the Labour Party's fault, let's face it. Yeah, definitely. For the last year, it's skyrocketed. I mean, it was skyrocketing beforehand, but let's just say it's the last year because it kind of makes it a lot more easy to blame on those hideous people in power. And indeed, they are pretty hideous, let's face it. Yeah, you see, I can slag off the Labour Party as well. Anyway, back to my point about send spending. Now, when Gove came in, he wanted to tackle send spending. Yes, it is as long ago as that, back in 2010. Whole government that was committed to austerity. And the model they used for their austerity was basically Canada in the 1990s, because Canada in the 1990s was able to cut back on government spending and everything was basically fine. The problem was that you may recall that during the 1990s, it was a bit of a boom time generally across the economy. You may think about the Blair years, etc. So when Canada did it, it was in a very, very different set of circumstances from when Gove et al. Did it in 2010. After that huge banking crash, due to deregulation, because after all, we've got to deregulate things, haven't we? Anyway, leaving aside that bitchy comment, yeah, we had this whole rearrangement of send stuff, and it was definitely a boom time in send, because if you're a solicitor or a lawyer that worked in that area, well, by God, you had work coming at you left, right, and centre. And what that basically meant was that there were various incentives for people like educational psychologists and speech and language people to very much deal with this kind of newly deregulated market in local authorities and hawk their wares. It pushed quite a lot of prices up, but generally speaking, in the early years, there wasn't a huge pressure on SEN budgets. But with austerity, and all of those glorious people, like Richard Tice, might come back to him in a bit, who are dedicated to government not doing anything, well, that's kind of what you get. Because when you decide to not do anything at the same time as cutting services, then you shore up problems for the future. Yeah, you might think that you can just basically ignore that hole in the roof. But, when it actually gets bigger, eventually you're going to have to not ignore it. You're going to have to do something about it. Or you could decide not to do anything about it, but it's not going away, is it? And it can lead to all sorts of other problems. The classic thing where your kitchen ceiling falls in because your bathroom ceiling has fallen in. All that kind of thing, right? Yeah, that's the way those things work. You have to do things proactively, otherwise they will get worse. Apart from maybe, I don't know, picking at that scab. Anyway, leaving aside those metaphors, yeah, you have to do things. Governments have to be proactive. And the problem we've had for the last 15 years in particular, but generically speaking for about the last 45 years, is this idea that governments shouldn't be proactive, which brings us to, where we are now, which is whereby there are no services for people whatsoever, effectively, right? So that leads to all sorts of on-costs, like, for example, in SEND provision, where there are loads and loads of kids who are making more and more demands on the system because there's fewer and fewer places out there that they can just get that generic support. Think about child poverty, which is through the roof. Think about unemployment. Think about low pay. Think about all of those things that nobody has really bothered to tackle, in particular in the last 15 years, but I would argue in about the last 40 years as well, but let's make it 15. Yeah, no one's bothered to do anything about it because we've had a government that says that they can't do anything about it because, after all, it can't be done, can it? And if things get any worse, well, what we need to do realistically is cut things more because, after all, that's the only thing we can do when we're faced with, a moribund economy. Which brings us back to this notion that Richard Tice seems to magically have, that if they come in, what they'll do is they'll sensibly cut things, not frontline services, oh good grief, no, they wouldn't do that, but sensibly cut things and everything will work again. It's just, I seem to recall that a lot of people who are actually brighter than Richard have tried that a lot in the past. I'm not suggesting George Osborne, because that whole thing about Canada was never going to work, as a wide variety of economists said so at the time. And oddly, it didn't, did it? Yes, you may recall that, we were going to pay off the debt by 2015. Didn't happen. Didn't happen, did it? No. Still, never mind, he staked his reputation on our AAA credit score, which we don't have, because the moment that didn't happen, he decided it just wasn't anything important anyway. And thus, we bump along the bottom. Meanwhile, George is doing extremely well financially, and Richard is doing extremely well financially, and the other people that are backing reform to the hilt with these kind of things will also do extremely well financially, and you won't, whether you're SEND or not. Now, you can decide that too much of your taxes is going on the poor. But the problem isn't that the poor exist. It's not their fault. It's a whole range of other things which the government just hasn't been bothered to do. And you can do that, but the warning from history is that if you decide to go down that route, nothing will change, and it leads to an awful lot of very, very extreme opinions, which you might then have to tackle with, I don't know, a huge tank building program, for example. Anyway, do have a glorious day if you can do. Oh, the weekend goes so quickly, yes. Enjoy.